Now, one objection to this small distortion rate is the claim that there are so many errors in the Bible. Some people claim that there are even 500,000 variants in the New Testament manuscript copies. Now, 500,000 is a big number, but take a look at this. Statistics sometimes distort the truth. For example, take a look at these three sentences here. One says, "You have won $10 million." Number 2 says, "Thou hast won $10 million." Number 3 says, "Y'all have won $10 million." Now, of the 27 letters in line 2, only 7 are the same in line 3, yet the message is 100% identical. So the point is that they are different in form, but not in content. Just because you have different letters and different words, that doesn't change the message. Even with the many differences, 100% of the message comes through. Well, many of the New Testament variations are of this kind. And that's important to note. A lot of it is grammar, some of it is spelling. Some of the words are different, but the same message is there. In fact, there are only 2 stories in the New Testament where scholars are skeptical whether the stories were actually part of the original Bible. The first one occurs at the end of Mark, and it looks like a later scribe may have added a little bit to the end of Mark to give a little more detail about the resurrection, because some of the other books of the Bible had more detail and Mark didn't. The second is the story in John where a woman is caught in adultery, and as she's about to be stoned, Jesus says, "He that is without sin cast the first stone." And gradually everyone drops their rock because they realize they're guilty of sin as well. Scholars think that it's possible that that story could have been added to the Bible. And while that's a cool story, if you were to eliminate that, that doesn't destroy any major Christian doctrine out there. Other than those 2 stories, most of the differences amongst the copies are much less significant. So the New Testament has more manuscripts, earlier manuscripts, and more accurately copied manuscripts than any other book in the ancient world. So if you're a skeptic and you reject the accuracy of the New Testament, you'd also have to reject every other ancient document in the ancient world. And think about it this way. The question of why don't we have the original New Testament? Well, a couple theories on that. If the original were preserved, we may have wars and squabbles over it, and it may be worshipped as a relic. God doesn't want us to worship the Bible. It's there for God to communicate His truth about what we believe. Secondly, if someone possessed the original, that person could change it. But if we only have copies, a change of a copy could be shown it was different than the others. So you can actually reconstruct the original with greater accuracy than if you had the original itself. And I think that's interesting. If we have the original, that could easily be altered, and then we could change it to whatever doctrine that person desired. But having all these different manuscripts, it's really hard to change over 5,000 Greek manuscripts plus all those other language manuscripts. So that original message stays far more intact that way than if we had the original. Now, of course, the other question, besides do we have an accurate copy of the New Testament, is, well, if we do have an accurate copy, what if the original document is not telling the truth? Do we have an accurate copy of a lie? Well, there are 6 lines of evidence that show that the New Testament is actually telling the truth, and I'll go over that very briefly. First of all, we have early testimony. For example, Jesus' crucifixion occurred in early 30 to 33 AD. Now, if you go to that 6th point, it says that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in 55 AD, and a creed in that book, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, goes all the way back to the event itself. And even liberal scholars agree that that creed is pre-40 AD, and this is the first entire writing of the gospel. So if that date is accurate, that particular creed is less than 10 years from the crucifixion. Another important point here is that most or all of the New Testament was written before 70 AD. Now, how do we surmise that? Well, that's because no mention is made of the destruction of the temple. The book of John and Revelation even act as though the temple is still standing. That would be kind of like a history of the World Trade Center towers being written without mention of 9/11. So if you had a book about the World Trade Center, and it didn't mention anything about 9/11 and its destruction, well, what would be your logical conclusion then? Yeah, it was written before September 11th, 2001. That's the type of argument that we're suggesting for why the New Testament, or most of it, was written before 70 AD. The destruction of the Jewish temple was such a significant event that not to mention it even in passing suggests that most of it was written before that event of 70 AD. And regardless of that point, it was written during the time that a lot of people who were around during these events were still alive. And it would be very difficult to make things up while people are still alive, because naturally those types of people would call out the fabrications and tell people it wasn't true. Now secondly, the New Testament contains eyewitness testimony. Now that doesn't mean every single author was an eyewitness, but it does mean that the writers had access to eyewitnesses to gain their information. For example, John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, gained a lot of his information from the Apostle Peter. Or on this chart here, Luke, who was not an eyewitness himself, carefully investigated the claims of Jesus, and he actually wrote 2 books, Acts and the Gospel of Luke. And as you can see here, in Acts, there are 84 historically confirmed eyewitness details, and that was actually confirmed by classical scholar and historian Colin Hemmer, and it includes a lot of minutiae and detail, including, I'll read a couple of these. The natural crossing between correctly named ports in Acts 13, 4-5 was proven correct. The correct implication that sea travel is the most convenient way of reaching Athens, with the favoring east winds of summer sailing, which is recorded in Acts 17, 14-15. Well-known shrines and images of Artemis that's recorded in Acts 19:24. Lots of little minutiae and details like that are included in Acts. 84 of those were discovered by Colin Hemmer. And Luke includes several others in his gospel. Now, why would Luke go to the trouble of investigating all these little minute details that were proven correct by scholars, and yet totally make up the idea of miracles? Well, if you philosophically ruled out the idea that miracles are possible, that's one thing, and we've already covered that. But if you're willing to admit that miracles are at least possible, and you acknowledge that Luke's details are accurate, I think that's good evidence that the mention of miracles by Luke are accurate as well. In addition, the New Testament documents cite more than 30 people that are confirmed by secular sources or archaeology. And here's a list of those individuals. We've got 1-15, Agrippa I all the way down to Gamaliel, and Herod Antipas all the way down to Tiberius Caesar, and you can see the references for each of those. In addition, archaeology confirms further evidence, specific details of things mentioned in the Bible. For example, it was discovered in 1961, this phrase that says Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, and that's dated between 26 and 37 AD. Or the ossuary of Joseph Caiaphas, who was the high priest from 18 to 36 AD, was discovered in 1990, and that includes his bones in there. He was an important character in the New Testament, because he was high priest when Jesus was on trial. So archaeology actually corroborates the historicity of the Bible. In fact, many archaeologists use the Bible to find different artifacts that are mentioned in the Bible. That's not something that archaeologists use for other ancient books, such as the Book of Mormon, where entire civilizations of the Nephites and Lamanites are not found anywhere, even though archaeologists have looked very thoroughly for them.